There are moments in life that don't feel like turning points when they happen. They feel like arguments. They feel like a bad night in a house with too much tension and too little grace. They feel like a door slamming, a bag being packed, a girl walking down a rain-soaked driveway in the dark with nothing but a backpack and 6 years of swallowed pain. That was the night everything changed for a 15-year-old girl named Maya. And while she walked those 6 cold blocks to her best friend's house, not knowing what came next, not knowing if she even had a home to return to, her father, a man named Robert, was lying in the dark of his bedroom, listening to the silence she had left behind. And he was making a decision. Not in anger. Not in haste. He was making the kind of decision that a careful man makes when he has spent months preparing for a moment exactly like this one. And by the time the sun came up over that quiet Ohio street the following morning, the woman who had screamed, "Get out of my house," would discover something that would stop her cold. It wasn't her house. It never had been. Before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the story you are about to hear is one of the most quietly powerful things we have ever covered on this channel. It is not a story about hatred. It is not a story about revenge. It is a story about a father who ran out of time but refused to run out of options. A man who, in the final chapter of his life, made sure that the one person he loved most in this world would still have a place to come home to. Even after he was gone. To understand what happened on that November night, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the argument. Not to the legal documents. You have to go back to a man named Robert Calloway. And you have to understand who Robert Calloway was before any of this started. Robert grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the second of 3 boys, raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital and a father who fixed transmission parts in a garage out back of the house. They were not wealthy people. But they were working people. And Robert absorbed that the way children absorb everything around them, quietly, completely, without being told. By the time he was in his late 20s, Robert was working in logistics management, the kind of job that doesn't make headlines but pays steady and offers a man with discipline a real shot at building something. He bought his first home at 32. A 3-bedroom house in a suburb east of Columbus, on a street with good schools and old oak trees that dropped their leaves every October like clockwork. He paid his mortgage the first of every month. He kept the gutters clean. He mowed his own lawn on Saturday mornings before the heat set in. And then, when Robert was 29 years old, he met a woman named Carol. Carol was a nurse. She laughed easily and cooked on Sundays and had a way of making a room feel warmer just by being in it. They married young and fast the way people do when they are certain. And for a few years, that house on the east side of Columbus was exactly what Robert had always been working toward. It was a home. A real one. And then, when their daughter Maya was 4 years old, Carol was diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer. She fought it for 18 months. And she lost. Robert was 34 years old when he buried his wife. Maya was not yet old enough to fully understand what she had lost. But she would feel the shape of that absence for the rest of her life. And so would Robert. Those first years alone with Maya are the years that people who knew Robert talk about most when they describe him. He did not fall apart. He did not disappear into work or drink or distraction the way some men do. He showed up. He drove Maya to school every morning and picked her up every afternoon. He learned how to braid her hair by watching YouTube videos at midnight after she was asleep, practicing on a rag doll until he got it right. He went to every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every soccer game where Maya sat mostly on the bench because she was more interested in the clouds than the ball. He made pancakes on Saturday mornings. He watched animated movies he didn't understand and asked questions about the characters because he wanted to understand what she loved. Those 5 years that Robert raised Maya alone were, by every account from people who knew the family, the most important years of their relationship. They built something between them that did not need language to describe. A closeness that came from shared grief and shared mornings and the particular intimacy of 2 people who only had each other to come home to. It was Robert's older brother Dale who first suggested that Robert consider dating again. Dale lived in Pittsburgh and called every Sunday, a habit that had started when Carol died and never stopped. He worried about Robert in the quiet way that older brothers worry, not loudly, but persistently. He thought Robert was lonely even when Robert said he wasn't. And truthfully, Robert was. He was 39 years old, and the nights after Maya went to bed were long and silent in a way that no amount of discipline or routine could entirely fill. So when a woman named Sandra Pruitt was introduced to him at a company event in the spring, and she laughed at something he said, and her laugh was warm and real and unexpected, Robert paid attention.
Sandra was 41 years old when she met Robert. She was sharp and put together and socially confident in the way that Robert, a quietly private man, found refreshing rather than threatening. She had no children of her own. She had been in a long engagement in her 30s that had ended badly, and she carried that history the way most people carry old pain, mostly concealed, occasionally visible. She was drawn to Robert's stability. His quietness. The way he talked about Maya with such uncomplicated love that it softened something in her that had been guarded for a long time. They dated for a year. Carefully, at first. Robert introduced Sandra to Maya slowly, the way you introduce a child to something new, without pressure, without forcing a conclusion, letting the relationship find its own shape. Maya was 9 years old. She was polite. She was watchful. She was, by every account, the kind of child who noticed things that adults assumed children missed. Robert and Sandra married 18 months after they met. It was a small wedding, a Saturday afternoon in September, at a venue on the edge of a lake outside Columbus. Dale came from Pittsburgh. Sandra's sister flew in from Phoenix. Maya was the flower girl and wore a pale yellow dress that Carol's mother had helped pick out, because Robert had thought that mattered and it did. And after the ceremony, Sandra Pruitt became Sandra Calloway, and she moved into the house that Robert had bought with overtime pay and careful saving 12 years before. The house with the oak trees. The house with Maya's bedroom where Carol's old photographs still sat on the nightstand. Sandra repainted the hallway within the first month. She said the old color was too dark. Robert didn't argue. He was a man who chose his battles. He would come to wonder, later, if he had chosen too few of them. Here is something that estate planning attorneys across this country will tell you, and it is worth slowing down to understand because it matters enormously to everything that comes later in this story. When a person buys a home before a marriage, that home is generally considered separate property. It was purchased with that person's earnings, in that person's name, before the legal union existed. A marriage does not automatically transfer ownership. A name on a mortgage or a deed means something specific and legal. A name on a lease means something different. And the feeling of belonging to a place, the feeling of calling it yours, of repainting its walls and hosting Christmases in its living room and referring to it in conversation as, my house, that feeling, however real, however human, is not a legal document. Sandra Calloway did not know this. Or perhaps she knew it in the abstract way that most people know things that don't yet feel personally relevant. She had moved into Robert's house. She had made it her own in the ways that people do. She had hung her artwork and changed the furniture arrangement and taken down the curtains Robert had bought with Carol and replaced them with something brighter. She called it home. She called it hers. And for 6 years, nobody corrected her, because nobody had a reason to yet. Maya noticed the curtains. She noticed the furniture. She was 12 years old when Sandra removed the photograph of Carol from the living room bookshelf and put it in a box in the hallway closet. Maya didn't say anything. She went to her room and wrote it down in her journal, the way she wrote down everything that felt wrong but didn't have words for yet. Maya had been keeping journals since she was 10 years old. A habit she developed after losing her mother, a way of holding on to things that felt like they were slipping. Those journals would matter later. But we are not there yet.
Robert noticed things too. He noticed that Sandra and Maya existed in a state of careful coexistence that never quite became warmth. He noticed that dinner table conversations between them were polite rather than easy. He told himself this was normal. He told himself blended families take time and that patience was the answer. He was right about the patience. He may have been wrong about how much time he had. Because in the winter of Maya's 13th year, Robert started having headaches. Not dramatic ones. Not the kind that send a man to an emergency room in the middle of the night. The quiet persistent kind that a man like Robert files away under stress and getting older and keeps moving. He took ibuprofen and went back to work and told himself it would pass. It did not pass. By spring, there were other symptoms. Fatigue that sleep didn't fix. Occasional difficulty finding words mid-sentence, a terrifying half-second stutter in his thoughts that he hoped no one else noticed. He made an appointment with his doctor in April. He sat in an examination room on a Tuesday morning and listened to his doctor use words that changed the shape of everything. The diagnosis was a progressive neurological condition. The prognosis was uncertain in its timeline but clear in its direction. Robert drove home from that appointment alone. He sat in the driveway for 17 minutes before he went inside. He did not tell Sandra that night. He did not tell Maya. The first person he called was Dale. The second call Robert made, within the same week as that diagnosis, was to a man named Gary Henderson. Gary Henderson was an estate attorney in Columbus whom Robert had been referred to by a colleague 3 years earlier, when Robert had briefly considered updating his basic will. He had never followed through at the time. He was following through now. Robert made an appointment and sat across from Gary Henderson in a quiet office and explained his situation with the careful precision of a man who had spent his whole life solving logistical problems. He had a house. He had a daughter. He had a wife who was not the daughter's mother. He had a diagnosis that suggested the window for making the right decisions was narrowing. He needed to know exactly what his options were and he needed to know them now. Gary Henderson had handled blended family estate cases for 22 years. He had seen what happened when fathers like Robert waited too long. He had seen the other side of those stories, the daughters who called his office years after the fact, fighting legal battles that should never have been necessary, trying to reclaim inheritances that had been quietly redirected by surviving stepmothers who had no legal obligation to honor the spirit of a father's wishes once the paperwork gave them control. He laid it out for Robert plainly. And Robert listened with the focus of a man who understood that this conversation was one of the most important he would ever have. The house Robert owned had been purchased in his name alone before the marriage. Sandra had never been added to the deed. This was not a calculated move on Robert's part, it had simply never come up, the way many things in marriages never come up until they matter. The fact that Sandra was not on the deed was significant. It meant the property was still, legally, Robert's separate property. It also meant that Robert had full authority to place the property into a revocable living trust with Maya named as the beneficiary, without requiring Sandra's signature or consent. Gary Henderson walked Robert through the structure carefully. A revocable living trust would allow Robert, as the trustee, to control the property during his lifetime. Upon his death or legal incapacitation, the trust would become irrevocable and the property would transfer to Maya as the named beneficiary, bypassing the standard probate process entirely. Sandra would have no automatic claim on the property. She had no mortgage payments documented. No property tax records in her name. Her contributions to the household, the groceries, the utilities, the renovations she'd overseen, were real and they were meaningful in a human sense, but they did not constitute legal ownership under Ohio property law. Robert sat with this information for a long moment. Then he asked Gary Henderson when they could begin. There was one more thing Robert did during those 8 months. He began documenting. He had always been an organized man, he kept receipts, he kept records, he kept files. But now he began keeping a different kind of record. A private journal, distinct from any financial document, where he wrote down what he observed in his own home. Not as accusations. Not as a legal strategy. Just as a father watching his daughter move through her own house and noticing the ways that house sometimes did not feel like it fully belonged to her. He wrote about the photograph Sandra had moved to the closet. He wrote about a parent-teacher conference Sandra had declined to attend because she had plans with her own friends that night. He wrote about a Saturday afternoon when Maya had come home upset about something that had happened at school, and Sandra had been on the phone in the other room and had not come off it. He wrote about the language Sandra used. The way she said, "my home," in a tone that subtly excluded. The way she referred to Maya's belongings as Maya's things, as if they were a collection of foreign objects that occupied a space otherwise entirely Sandra's. Robert was not a man who dramatized. His journal entries were measured and factual. But read together, over the span of those 8 months, they told a story. And it was a story that Robert understood even if he had never confronted it directly. His daughter was growing up in a house where she was tolerated more than she was welcomed. And Robert, a man with a narrowing window and a clear-eyed attorney and a very specific set of legal tools available to him, had decided what he was going to do about it. By the fall of Maya's sophomore year of high school, the household had settled into the particular kind of tension that never quite breaks into open conflict but never fully lifts either. Sandra and Maya were polite to each other in the practiced, surface-level way of people who have understood for a long time that real warmth is not coming and have adjusted accordingly. Robert moved through his days in the quiet awareness that his condition was progressing and his time was not unlimited and the legal structure he had built was in place and waiting. He had told Gary Henderson to be ready. He had told Dale to be ready. He had written letters and sealed them in envelopes and placed them in a safe in his home office where Sandra never went because she didn't know the combination. He had done everything that could be done in advance. What he had not done, what he could not have planned for precisely, was the specific night it would all come to a head. That night was a Tuesday in November. The kind of November evening in Ohio that is cold and dark before 5 o'clock and carries the particular weight of a year getting old. Maya had been at her friend Destiny's house after school, working on a history project. She had a curfew of 8:30. She walked through the front door at 9:14. She was 44 minutes late. She had a string of text messages on her phone explaining that the project had run over and that she had tried to call the house phone and gotten no answer. Sandra was in the kitchen when Maya came in. And whatever Sandra had been carrying through that day, the particular accumulation of frustrations and resentments and small grievances that people carry without examining, it came out in that kitchen, directed at a 15-year-old girl who was 44 minutes late and tired and hungry and had spent her evening doing schoolwork. The argument started about the curfew. But curfews are rarely just about curfews. Within minutes it had moved to Maya's attitude, to her disrespect, to the way she treated this house like a hotel, to the way she expected things to be done for her without gratitude. Maya, who was 15 and tired and had her mother's capacity for measured response when she wasn't pushed too far, said something back. Accounts differ on exactly what she said. What is not in dispute is what happened next. Sandra's voice, which had been climbing in pitch and volume for the better part of 5 minutes, reached a register that carried all the way upstairs to Robert's bedroom, where he was lying in the dark with a headache that had been building since mid-afternoon. And then Sandra said it. Twice. The first time at regular volume. The second time louder, pointing toward the front door. Get out of my house. 44 words had been exchanged in that kitchen, give or take, and those 5 were the ones that would echo through a courthouse and a hospital and a father's final months and a young woman's adult life for years to come. Get out of my house. Maya looked at her stepmother for a long moment. She did not cry. She did not shout back. She went to her bedroom, put her school bag down, picked up the overnight bag she kept packed in her closet out of some unexamined instinct she had developed over the past 2 years, and she walked back downstairs and out the front door. It was raining. She walked 6 blocks to Destiny's house. Destiny's mother opened the door, took one look at Maya standing in the rain, and said, "Come in, baby," without asking a single question. Maya sat down at the kitchen table, and she did not cry until she was holding a mug of hot tea that Destiny's mother had put in her hands. And then she cried for a long time. Upstairs, in that bedroom on the east side of Columbus, Robert Calloway heard the front door close. He lay still in the dark for a moment. Then he reached for his phone. He made the first call to Dale. It lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He made the second call to Gary Henderson's emergency line. Gary had given Robert that number 6 months earlier, specifically for this purpose. That call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Then Robert lay back down in the dark, and he thought about Carol. He thought about the way Carol used to come into Maya's room at night and check that she was covered and sleeping. He thought about the promise he had made at Carol's grave, a promise he had never spoken aloud to anyone but that he had carried every single day since, that Maya would be okay. That she would be taken care of. That whatever else he failed at, he would not fail at that. He thought, tonight was the night. Not because it was planned for tonight specifically. But because tonight had shown him something he no longer had the luxury of waiting to confirm. And then he picked up his phone one more time and he texted Gary Henderson 2 words. 2 words that Gary would later say, in a conversation with Dale, were the simplest and most decisive legal instruction he had received in 22 years of practice. The text said, "Activate it." What Robert had activated, in the simplest terms, was the irrevocable stage of his trust structure. The revocable living trust he had established 8 months earlier had contained a provision, a specific legal instruction, that allowed Robert, as the sole grantor, to convert the trust from revocable to irrevocable at a time of his choosing, provided he was still of sound mind and acting as trustee. Gary Henderson had advised this structure precisely because of the situation they both understood was coming, a moment at which Robert needed the trust to be locked. Not changeable. Not contestable on the grounds that Robert might later have second thoughts or might later be influenced by a surviving spouse. Locked. The house in the trust. Maya as the named beneficiary. The trust's terms specifying that Maya's residency rights in the property were protected and that any other resident's right to remain in the property was at the discretion of the trust's successor trustee, who was Dale. Not Sandra. Dale. Gary Henderson received Robert's text, reviewed the trust documentation he had already prepared for exactly this conversion, and by 2:17 in the morning, the paperwork was in process. The house on the east side of Columbus, with its oak trees and its old gutters and its pale yellow walls and the kitchen that Sandra had chosen, was no longer a house that Sandra Calloway had any legal claim to. It may have been that way all along, technically. But now it was on paper in a way that could not be undone. Sandra woke at 7:15 the following morning. Robert was not in the bed. This was not immediately unusual. Robert had been sleeping poorly for months, often up before dawn, sometimes already in the kitchen or his office when she came downstairs. She made coffee. She checked her phone. She noticed that Maya's bedroom door was open and the room was empty, but she assumed Maya had gone to school early. She did not immediately worry. The worry began 45 minutes later, when a neighbor knocked on the front door and told Sandra that an ambulance had come in the night, that Robert had called from his phone at around 3 in the morning and that he had been taken to Grant Medical Center. Sandra drove to the hospital still in the clothes she'd grabbed off the bedroom chair. She found Robert in a room on the 3rd floor, awake but diminished, attached to monitors, looking like a man who had spent his last reserves on something important the night before. His brother Dale was already there. Dale had driven from Pittsburgh through the night. He looked at Sandra when she came in with the particular expression of a man who knows something the other person does not yet know and is not going to be the one to tell them. Robert looked at Sandra and said, "There's an envelope on the kitchen table. I need you to read it." Sandra drove back to the house. The envelope was there, as he had said, white, sealed, addressed in Robert's handwriting. She opened it at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. Inside was a letter in Robert's hand, 2 pages, and behind it a set of documents she did not recognize at first. The letter began, "Sandra, I need you to understand some things I should have made clearer a long time ago." She read the letter. Then she read the documents. Then she read the documents again. Then she sat at that kitchen table for a long time without moving. The house was very quiet. Outside, an oak tree was dropping its last November leaves onto the driveway. And Sandra Calloway began to understand, slowly and completely, that the ground she had believed was solid beneath her feet for 6 years had been something else entirely. The documents were a summary of the trust structure and its recent conversion, prepared by Gary Henderson and included in the envelope at Robert's specific instruction. They explained, in plain language, that the property at the address Sandra was sitting in had been held in a revocable living trust since the previous February, with Maya Calloway as the sole beneficiary. They explained that the trust had been formally converted to irrevocable status in the early morning hours of that same day. They explained that Sandra's legal status in the property was that of a permitted resident during Robert's lifetime, a status that had now been transferred to the purview of the trust's successor trustee, Robert's brother Dale Calloway of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They explained that Sandra had no ownership interest in the property, had never been added to the deed, and had no legal claim under Ohio property law based on her contributions to household expenses, as those contributions had been made to a household, not to a mortgage. And they explained, in the final paragraph, that Robert had prepared this structure not out of malice but out of love for his daughter and out of a responsibility he had felt since the day Carol died, a responsibility to make sure Maya would always have a home. The letter itself said, "I am sorry I did not tell you sooner. I am sorry I let things go on the way they did. This is not about punishing you. It is about keeping a promise I made to a woman who trusted me to keep it." Sandra called an attorney at 9 o'clock that morning. She called her sister in Phoenix at 9:15. She sat in that kitchen for most of the rest of the day, making calls and receiving them, and trying to recalibrate a reality that had shifted underneath her overnight in a way she had not seen coming and could not have prepared for. That evening, she drove back to the hospital. Robert was awake. They spoke for a while, the two of them, alone in that room. What they said to each other in that conversation has never been shared by anyone who was there. Robert was a private man. Even at the end, he kept certain things for himself. What is known is that Sandra drove home afterward, and that she cried in the car for a long time in the hospital parking lot before she could. Meanwhile, Maya was still at Destiny's house, unaware of most of what had happened through the night. Destiny's mother had let her stay over, had called the school and reported her absent, had made her breakfast and asked no questions except one, "Are you safe?" Maya had said yes. It was the truest thing she knew how to say that morning. Late that afternoon, her phone rang. It was Dale. She had met Dale a handful of times over the years, at holidays, at a birthday dinner, at the kind of family occasions where her father's brother would come from Pittsburgh and sit across the table and have the same quiet watchfulness that Robert had, the family trait, that look of a man who listens more than he speaks. Dale told her that her father was in the hospital and was stable. He told her that he was on his way to her. He told her there were some things she needed to know. He drove to Destiny's house and sat with Maya in Destiny's mother's living room, and he told her about the trust. He told her about the documents. He told her about the letter Robert had written. He told her that the house was hers, had been put in trust for her, and that no one was going to take it from her. Maya was 15 years old and she sat very still while Dale talked, and when he finished she looked at him and said, "He knew. He knew for a long time, didn't he?" And Dale said, "Yes. He did." And Maya looked out the window for a moment and said, "That's so like him." In the days and weeks that followed, the legal machinery that Robert had set in motion continued to turn with the precision he had built into it. Sandra retained an attorney and explored every available avenue. Her legal team put forward several arguments. The first was a constructive trust claim, the argument that Sandra's contributions to the household over 6 years implied a shared ownership interest that the law should recognize even in the absence of her name on a deed. The second was a challenge to the timing of the trust's conversion, the argument that Robert had acted under emotional duress on the night of the argument, and that a decision made in the middle of the night during a crisis could be questioned on grounds of sound judgment. The third, and most carefully considered, was an argument about Sandra's reasonable expectation, that she had entered a marriage in good faith, had contributed to a home in good faith, and that the law should account for the reasonable belief of a spouse who had been given no indication that her position in that home was legally precarious. These were not frivolous arguments. They were the arguments of a woman who genuinely believed she had been wronged. And it is worth sitting with that for a moment, because this story is not simple, and the people in it are not cartoons. Sandra Calloway had given 6 years of her life to that house and that marriage. She had been there through Robert's bad days and his quiet ones and the slow accumulation of ordinary time that constitutes a life shared. She had believed it was hers in the way a person believes in things they have never been explicitly told are not true. But belief, as Robert's attorney Gary Henderson would note in his response to each of Sandra's legal arguments, is not a property right. Sandra's constructive trust argument failed because there was no documented financial contribution to the mortgage or property taxes, contributions that would have been required to establish a legal claim to equity. Sandra's duress argument failed because the trust conversion had been in preparation for 8 months and had been structured precisely to withstand that challenge. Gary Henderson had anticipated it. Sandra's reasonable expectation argument was the most sympathetic and also the most legally difficult to pursue, because Ohio property law is specific about what constitutes ownership, and Sandra's name had never been on the deed. A judge reviewing the preliminary filings found the trust to be validly executed, properly structured, and unambiguous in its intent. Sandra's legal challenge was not dead after that ruling, but the road ahead of her was steep and expensive and the outcome was increasingly clear. It was Robert's journals that changed the emotional temperature of the legal proceedings in a way that no one had fully anticipated. During the discovery phase, Sandra's attorney requested documentation related to Robert's state of mind and decision-making process during the period in which the trust was established. Gary Henderson provided Robert's personal journals. Not as a legal weapon, Robert had not written them for that purpose, but as evidence of a consistent, documented, long-standing intention that predated the November argument by many months. Sandra's attorney read those journals. He read about the photograph in the closet. He read about the parent-teacher conference Sandra had skipped. He read about the kitchen moments and the language and the small daily accumulation of a daughter being made to feel like a guest in her father's home. He read Robert's entry from 8 months before the incident, made appointment with Henderson today. Can't wait any longer. Have to know she's protected. He read the entry from 2 months later, signed the documents today. The house is Maya's. It was always Maya's. I should have done this years ago. He read entries that were not accusations but that were, taken together, a quiet and devastating portrait of a father who had watched and waited and finally acted. Sandra's attorney came to Sandra after reading those journals and had a frank conversation about the strength of her position. Sandra listened. She did not speak for a long time. Then she asked one question, is there any version of this where I win? Her attorney was quiet for a moment. Then he told her the truth. What happened next surprised nearly everyone who had been watching the case unfold. Sandra requested a private meeting. Not through attorneys. She asked, through Dale, to speak with Maya directly. One conversation, no lawyers, in a neutral location of Maya's choosing. Maya, who was 16 by then and living temporarily with Dale while the legal situation was sorted, thought about the request for 2 days before answering. She talked to Dale. She talked to Destiny. She talked to Robert by phone, because Robert was still alive then, still in the care facility outside Columbus, still calling Maya every Tuesday and Friday evening, his voice slower but his mind clear and his laugh still the same. Robert told Maya, it's your decision. Whatever you choose, I'll back you. Maya said, I think I want to hear what she has to say. And so they met. A Thursday morning in December, at a diner on the west side of Columbus that neither of them had any history with. Maya came with Dale. Sandra came alone. They sat in a booth by the window and ordered coffee they didn't drink, and they talked for an hour and 20 minutes. No one else in that diner knew who they were or what they were working through. They looked like a woman and a teenager having a quiet December morning conversation. Which was, in its own way, exactly what they were. What was said in that booth has never been fully disclosed. Maya has spoken about it in general terms. She has said that Sandra did not make excuses. She has said that Sandra acknowledged things that Maya had needed acknowledged for a long time. She has said that Sandra cried, genuinely, not in a performative way, and that this mattered to her. She has also said that Sandra told her something about her own childhood that Maya had not known, something that helped her understand, not excuse, but understand, how Sandra had come to be the person she was in that house. Maya did not walk out of that diner with a stepmother. She walked out with something more useful and more honest, clarity. The following Monday, Sandra's attorney filed a notice of withdrawal from the legal challenge. Sandra vacated the property within 30 days, as specified in the trust's provisions. She did not hold a yard sale or take things that weren't hers or make the exit ugly. She packed her belongings and she left. A neighbor who watched the moving van from across the street later said, it was the quietest thing I ever saw. She just went. Robert lived for 4 more months. Maya visited him every Tuesday and Friday, the same days he called her, so that the visits and the calls could overlap and she could sit in the room with him and they could talk about things that were not dying, about the house and the oak trees and what she planned to do with the yard in the spring, and about Carol, about whom they talked more freely and more warmly in those final months than they ever had when the effort of maintaining a household had made such conversations feel like too much weight to carry on a weeknight. Dale came down from Pittsburgh every second weekend. He and Robert would watch football on Saturday afternoons with the sound low and the conversation easy, the way brothers do when they have said the important things and can afford to just be in a room together. Robert died on a Tuesday morning in March, which Maya has always said felt intentional, like he was making sure she would come that day. She was with him when he went. She held his hand. She told him it was okay to go. She told him she was going to be okay. She told him the house was going to be fine. She told him she was going to plant something in the backyard in the spring, a garden, something Carol would have liked. And then he was gone. Maya moved back into the house that April. She was 16 years old, with Dale as her legal guardian and the trust as her legal protection and a set of house keys that had been on Robert's keychain since 1999 when he first bought the place. She painted her room a deep, warm terracotta color that she'd seen in a magazine and always wanted. She rehung every photograph. The one of Carol that Sandra had put in the hallway closet, that one she brought back to the living room bookshelf, exactly where it had always been, in the exact spot where the afternoon light hit it just right and made it look almost like it was glowing. She found Robert's journals in the home office safe, along with a note in his handwriting that said, "For Maya, when she's ready." She read them over the course of a week, a few pages at a time, sitting in the living room with the afternoon light coming through the window. She cried through most of it. Not from sadness, though there was sadness. But from the specific, profound relief of discovering that someone had been watching over you all along, even when you thought you were alone. Her father had seen everything. He had written it down. And then, quietly, without drama or confrontation, he had fixed it. Here is what attorneys who specialize in blended family estates will tell you, and it is information that gets more relevant with every year that passes and every family that goes through what the Calloways went through. In the United States, 4 out of every 10 families are blended families. That means millions of households containing children from previous relationships, stepparents who have moved into homes they did not build, and fathers and mothers who have not updated their estate planning to reflect the reality of those new configurations. The most common outcome in cases like Robert and Sandra's, according to estate litigation attorneys at firms across this country, is not Maya's outcome. The most common outcome is Carrie's outcome. Or the outcomes described in probate courtrooms in California and Ohio and Oregon and Texas every single year, where children who believed they were protected discover after their parents' death that they were not. Where stepmothers or stepfathers who survive a spouse have full legal authority to redirect assets, change trusts, and leave biological children with nothing, because the paperwork was not done correctly or was not done at all. Robert Calloway was, in the language of estate attorneys, the rare father who got it right. He got it right because he had a diagnosis that forced him to confront his mortality earlier than most. He got it right because he found Gary Henderson. And he got it right because he understood, at a fundamental level, that love without documentation is a wish, and that wishes do not hold up in a probate court. Maya is in her mid-20s now. She still lives in that house on the east side of Columbus. She finished high school there, attended college in-state so she could keep the house, and is currently studying real estate law, a choice that people who know her story find either deeply ironic or entirely inevitable. The oak trees in the front yard are older now and drop their leaves a little earlier every October. The terracotta walls in her bedroom have been repainted twice since she first put them up, once because she changed her mind about the shade, and once because she wanted to start fresh after a hard year. She tends a garden in the backyard, exactly as she told Robert she would. She grows tomatoes and zucchini and a border of sunflowers along the east fence that her mother would have liked. She has Carol's photograph in the living room and Robert's journals in the bookshelf in the hallway, next to her own journals, which fill an entire shelf now, the record of a life observed carefully and written down faithfully by a girl who learned that habit from a father who understood its value. Dale calls every Sunday. He has called every Sunday since Carol died, without missing one. Maya answers every time. Sandra remarried and moved out of Ohio. She and Maya do not have a relationship, but there is no active conflict, just the quiet, particular distance of two people who occupied the same house for 6 years and came to understand each other too late to become anything more than what they were. Maya has said, in the careful way she has of speaking about things that carry weight, that she holds no hatred toward Sandra. She has said that what happened in that diner on a Thursday morning in December changed something in her, not into forgiveness exactly, but into something more useful. Understanding. The recognition that people do damage out of their own wounds as often as they do it out of malice. The recognition that her father, in his quiet way, had known this too, and had chosen to protect her through a legal instrument rather than through a confrontation that would have resolved nothing and hurt everyone. That was who Robert Calloway was. Careful. Methodical. 3 steps ahead. He built one house in his life. And he made sure it would still be standing for his daughter long after he was gone. Before we close tonight, I want to ask you something. And I want you to sit with it honestly, the way Robert sat with hard things when they needed sitting with. If something happened to you tomorrow, if you got a phone call from a doctor that changed the shape of your future, would the people who depend on you be protected? Not in the way you intend. Not in the way you've been meaning to get around to. But on paper. With a structure that no argument, no bad night, no raised voice at the top of a staircase could undo. Robert Calloway was 39 years old with a neurological diagnosis and an attorney's phone number and the willingness to do the uncomfortable work of making sure. Most people are not forced into that clarity. Most people believe they have more time. Most people are wrong about that in ways they never discover until it is too late for the people they love. So consider this story not just as something that happened to a family in Ohio, but as an instruction. A quiet, clear, practical instruction from a man who got it right. Make the appointment. Find the Gary Henderson in your city. Put your house where your love is, on paper, in a trust, in a document that will still be standing on a Tuesday morning in March when you are no longer there to speak for yourself. Because the greatest thing a parent can leave a child is not a house. It is certainty. It is the knowledge that someone thought of everything. It is coming home to a place that was always yours and always will be. Sandra said, "Get out of my house." And the house answered, in the language of irrevocable trust documents and notarized signatures and 8 months of quiet preparation, "No." It was never your house. It was always hers. And it will be hers long after all of us are gone. Drop a comment below right now and tell me, did Robert do the right thing? Did Sandra deserve what happened to her, or was she a victim of a system she didn't know existed? I want to read every single response. This one is going to divide the comments section, and I am here for it. And if this story hit you differently than you expected, if you came in thinking you knew what kind of story this was and you're leaving with something more complicated, that is exactly what we do on this channel. Every week. Real stories. Real stakes. The kind of thing they don't teach you in school but that matters more than almost anything else. Subscribe. Stay with us. Because next week, we are covering a case that will make your jaw drop, a son who discovered, the day after burying his mother, that she had been quietly supporting a second family on the other side of the country for 23 years. The paper trail she left behind changes everything you think you know about that story. You will not want to miss it. We'll see you then. Before we close tonight, I want to ask you something. And I want you to sit with it honestly, the way Robert sat with hard things when they needed sitting with. If something happened to you tomorrow, if you got a phone call from a doctor that changed the shape of your future, would the people who depend on you be protected? Not in the way you intend. Not in the way you've been meaning to get around to. But on paper. With a structure that no argument, no bad night, no raised voice at the top of a staircase could undo. Robert Calloway was 39 years old with a neurological diagnosis and an attorney's phone number and the willingness to do the uncomfortable work of making sure. Most people are not forced into that clarity. Most people believe they have more time. Most people are wrong about that in ways they never discover until it is too late for the people they love. So consider this story not just as something that happened to a family in Ohio, but as an instruction. A quiet, clear, practical instruction from a man who got it right. Make the appointment. Find the Gary Henderson in your city. Put your house where your love is, on paper, in a trust, in a document that will still be standing on a Tuesday morning in March when you are no longer there to speak for yourself. Because the greatest thing a parent can leave a child is not a house. It is certainty. It is the knowledge that someone thought of everything. It is coming home to a place that was always yours and always will be. Sandra said, "Get out of my house." And the house answered, in the language of irrevocable trust documents and notarized signatures and 8 months of quiet preparation, no. It was never your house. It was always hers. And it will be hers long after all of us are gone. Drop a comment below right now and tell me, did Robert do the right thing? Did Sandra deserve what happened to her, or was she a victim of a system she didn't know existed? I want to read every single response. This one is going to divide the comments section, and I am here for it. And if this story hit you differently than you expected, if you came in thinking you knew what kind of story this was and you're leaving with something more complicated, that is exactly what we do on this channel. Every week. Real stories. Real stakes. The kind of thing they don't teach you in school but that matters more than almost anything else. Subscribe. Stay with us. Because next week, we are covering a case that will make your jaw drop, a son who discovered, the day after burying his mother, that she had been quietly supporting a second family on the other side of the country for 23 years. The paper trail she left behind changes everything you think you know about that story. You will not want to miss it. We'll see you then.